The well bucket fell too long before it struck water. Tavi Washaki stood with both hands on the crank listening to that hollow descent vanish down the dark throat of the well, and the sound made something cold move under her ribs. The morning had not yet broken over Wind River country. The ridgeline was still black against a sky the color of old iron, and the little Wind River beyond her cottonwoods had gone so quiet she could hear the rope creak fiber by fiber through the pulley. Then at last the bucket hit, not with the full slap she remembered from spring, but with a thin, distant splash. Tavi closed her eyes. For 3 weeks, she had been measuring the creek with a notched willow stick, pressing it into the same mud beside the same bend where the bank dipped low, and the sedge grass usually stayed green into June. Every few mornings, the waterline fell a finger's width. Not enough for a man passing on horseback to notice. Not enough for the old farmers to stop talking about snowmelt in ordinary seasons, but enough for her. Enough to make her wake before dawn with numbers moving behind her eyes. She hauled the bucket up slowly, the crank handle biting into the thick pads of her palms. She was a big girl, broad in the shoulders, heavy through the hips, with arms made strong by 2 years of carrying water, splitting kindling, and lifting feed sacks no one had offered to carry for her. Folks saw the size of her before they saw anything else. Some saw it and smirked. Some saw it and decided she was built for labor but not for thought. Some called her sturdy when they meant slow healthy, when they meant fat, and poor thing when they meant alone. Tavi had learned to let words pass over her like dry wind. Water didn't care what a body looked like. Neither did soil. She poured the buckets into the barrel beside the well, then walked toward the creek with her willow stick in hand. Her cabin sat behind her low and patched the chinking still uneven where she had repaired it after the winter winds. Her barn leaned east, though it had not yet fallen. 4 cleared acres stretched beyond the cabin, waiting for seed, waiting for faith, waiting for more water than the sky seemed willing to give. At the creek bend, she crouched and pushed the stick into the mud. The mark sat nearly 2 inches above the water. Tavi stayed there a moment, her breath quiet, her knees sinking into the damp edge of the bank. 2 inches did not sound like a disaster. 2 inches was nothing in a story told by loud men around a feed store stove. But 2 inches in May before the heat had truly begun meant something was wrong up in the mountains, or wrong in the snowpack, or wrong in the season itself. She wiped the stick clean on her skirt and stood. By noon, the valley would be awake enough to laugh at her. They had already begun in their way. Abel Mercer, who had worked land along the Little Wind for 30 years and wore his experience like a second coat, had told her after Sunday service that the creek always dipped before it rose. "Mountain snow comes when it comes," he had said not unkindly, which somehow made it harder to answer. "You worry too much, Tavi." Caleb Rusk had been less gentle. He had looked at her notched stick and chuckled loud enough for 3 men to hear. "Girl's measuring mud now," he said. "Maybe she figures if she stares hard enough she can scare water uphill." Martha Bell had touched Tavi's sleeve with pitying fingers and told her not to trouble herself sick. Her daughter Lena, 12 years old and sharp-eyed, had watched Tavi instead of the stick. Tavi had smiled at all of them. She had said nothing. Now, with the creek lower than yesterday and the well sounding farther away, she hitched her mule before the sun cleared the ridge. The idea had returned to her in the dark, the way old things sometimes returned when fear had scraped the mind clean. 3 years earlier, before she filed this claim, before she had her own roof to patch or her own field to fail, she had worked 6 weeks near a Colorado trading settlement for an old Mexican gardener who grew tomatoes red as sealing wax in soil that should not have supported thistles. He had shown her buried clay vessels unglazed and round-bellied, sunk into the earth with only their necks showing. "The roots come to the water," he had told her, "not the water to the roots. That way nothing is wasted." She had carried those words without knowing she was carrying them. Before leaving, she went to Noconi Red Willow. The old woman lived near the agency road in a cabin that smelled of sage, smoke-dried beans, and old wool. Noconi was Eastern Shoshone, like Tavi's mother had been, though older than any grief Tavi knew how to name. She had been a midwife, a seed keeper, a clay worker, and a widow long enough to speak of death as if it were a neighbor who had borrowed too many tools. She listened while Tavi explained the falling creek, the clay vessels, the field, and the money in the tin box under her floor. Noconi did not interrupt. She rolled a pinch of gray clay between her fingers, testing something only she could feel. At last she said, "The roots know where the water is, even when men standing above ground call it foolish." Tavi looked at her. Noconi's face did not soften, but her eyes did. "If you do this, do it before the ground turns mean." Clay waits for no pride. Neither does Drought. I have $47, Tavi said, and some coins. Then you have enough to begin, and not enough to be careless. That was all the blessing Tavi expected and more than she had come for. She drove toward the supply route with the mule stepping slow under the rising heat. Elias Crowheart found her by the road west of Lander where freight wagons cut deep tracks into the dry ground. He was half Shoshone, half white, and belonged fully to neither side except the road itself. He hauled goods between Fort Washakie, Lander, and Cheyenne, and knew the price of flour, the mood of clerks, and which merchants cheated women when they came in alone. He looked at her empty wagon and then at her face. "What are you buying that makes you look like you already lost the argument, Clay Potts?" she said. "How many 300? Elias stared at her for a long second. Then he rubbed a hand over his mouth, not quite hiding the beginning of a smile. "Tavi, by sundown tomorrow, every fence post from here to Fort Washakie will know. Then let them talk while the ground is still soft enough to dig." He did not smile after that. The merchant tried to overcharge her. He looked first at her body, then at her braids, then at the worn cuff of her sleeve, and decided several things wrongly before opening his mouth. Elias caught the false count. Tavi made the man count again. She paid in coins that had taken 2 years of hard weather to save. When the wagon was loaded, the clay pot sat nested in straw like sleeping birds. She drove home with $8 and some change left in her pocket. Caleb Rusk was the first to stop at her fence. "What in God's name is all that he called clay pots?" Tavi said, lifting one down from the wagon. "I can see that. You planning to cook supper for the whole territory? What then? Bury them." He laughed so hard he had to lean on the rail. By afternoon, there were 3 more watching. By evening, Martha Bell had passed slow in her wagon, pretending she had not come that way on purpose. Abel Mercer paused long enough to see the rows Tavi had marked with string and stakes. He said nothing, but his silence had weight. The next morning, the jokes had ripened. "She's planting bowls. Maybe clay grows better than corn. Big girl like that digs like a badger. She'll bury herself before she's done." Tavi heard every word. She dug anyway. The first hole took longer than it should have. The soil near the surface had already begun to harden, and her shovel struck small stones that jarred her wrists. She set the first pot 10 inches down, packed earth around its belly, and left the narrow neck just above the surface. 4 feet over, she dug again. By noon, sweat had soaked the back of her dress. Dust clung to her neck. Her knees ached from kneeling, rising, kneeling again. Her palms blistered, then opened. She wrapped them in torn cloth and kept moving. Nokoni came near sunset with a pouch of seeds and stood at the edge of the marked rows. "Corn first," she said. "Beans after the corn has a hand's height. Squash when the soil is warm enough to hold its own memory. I know, you know some. The ground will teach the rest." Elias came 2 days later with a sack of flour he claimed had split loose from a freight order. It did not, Tavi said. It might have. "I'll pay you in squash if I get any," when he said, "Not if." She looked at him, then, too tired to hide what the word did to her. He set the sack inside the cabin and left without making her thank him. For 9 days she worked the field. Before dawn she filled the buried pots from the well, one by one, listening to the water vanish into the dark clay bellies underground. After sunrise she dug. After digging she planted. After planting she measured the creek and marked the well rope and counted how many vessels still waited in the wagon. The valley laughed until it grew bored with laughing. Then, late in June, Lana Bell stopped by the fence while Tavi was filling the eastern row. The girl stood with both hands around the rail, her bonnet pushed back, her eyes narrowed in serious study. "Mama Lena called her corn is greener than ours." Martha Bell stopped in the road. "Don't stare." "But it is." Tavi did not turn. She poured water into the next clay neck and listened as it disappeared below the cracked skin of the earth. Behind her, Martha said nothing for a long while. That evening, Tavi lowered the bucket into the well and counted the seconds before it struck water. 1, 2, 3, 4. The splash came thin and far below. In. She stood alone in the dimming yard, her wrapped hands tight around the crank. While beyond the cottonwoods, the Little Wind River moved so quietly it seemed to be holding its breath. Her field was beginning to live. The well was beginning to fall. And somewhere beyond the ridge, the dry season was coming toward them all with its mouth open. The Little Wind River stopped singing on the 12th day of July. Tavi noticed it before sunrise when she stepped out with the first bucket of water and heard nothing beyond the cottonwoods. No soft run over stone, no low murmur against the bank, No silver movement in the dark, only crickets, the groan of the well rope, and the dry scrape of her own breathing. She stood still with the bucket handle cutting into her fingers. For a moment she hoped the silence was only distance. Then she walked down to the creek bend with her notched willow stick and saw the truth of it laid bare. The water had broken into separate pools, dark and still, with mud shining between them like old wounds. The place where the current used to move was nothing now but wet stones and trapped minnows flickering in shallow water that would be gone by noon. Tavi pressed the stick into the mud anyway. The mark sat useless above the pool. She stared at it until the eastern sky paled. By the time the sun came up, the valley had changed, though most folks would not admit it yet. Dust rose from the road and stayed there. Horses stood with their heads low beside troughs. Cottonwood leaves turned their pale undersides to the light, as if trying to hide from it. The fields beyond Tavi's fence had begun to take on that gray-yellow look crops got when their roots were asking questions no one could answer. Hers was still green. Not pretty green, not storybook green. The corn was leaner than she wanted, and some of the squash leaves curled by afternoon as if praying for shade. The beans had not climbed as thickly as she had hoped, but each morning after the night cooled the soil and the clay pots gave back what she had poured into them, the plants stood up again. That was enough. Enough was not a soft word. Enough had edges. Enough had weight. Enough meant her hands split open under the cloth wraps and her back seized when she bent too long over the pot necks. Enough meant starting at 3:30 because the sun came mean by 6. Enough meant drawing water from a well that sounded farther away each week. She had learned to listen to the bucket fall the way some people listen to hymns. On a good morning, she filled 90 pots before light struck the field. On a bad morning, the rope snagged or her grip failed or the mule brayed from the barn like he had suffered a personal injustice, and she filled fewer. Then she would stand in the rows after sunrise with sweat running down her temples, looking at the small, dark circles where water had gone into the earth, knowing she had not done enough and knowing she had done all she could. The valley watched. At first, they watched with the same old amusement, though the laughter came thinner now. Caleb Rusk still had a mouth on him, but even he did not laugh as loud once his bean rows started to curl brown at the edges. Martha Bell passed the road twice in 1 week and didn't wave either time. Abel Mercer rode by slow eyes on Tavi's corn, his face set beneath his hat like a door barred from inside. In town, Elias Crowheart told her the talk had changed. "They are not calling you foolish as much," he said one evening, standing by the barn while Tavi rubbed salve into the cracked place at the base of her thumb. "What are they calling me now?" "Hard to say." He leaned one shoulder against the post. "Some call it luck. Caleb says you must have better soil. One man at the feed store said maybe Shoshone women know charms for dry ground." Tavi snorted. "If I knew charms, I would have charmed myself a better well rope." Elias smiled, but only for a second. His eyes moved toward the well. "How far has it dropped? Enough. That is not a number. It is the number I am giving you." He did not press. That was one thing she liked about Elias. He knew when a door was closed and when it was only waiting for a quieter hand. Noconi Red Willow came the next morning carrying a bundle of sage and a small sack of dried chokecherries. She found Tavi in the eastern rows crouched beside a squash plant pressing 2 fingers into the soil. "Too much on this one," Noconi said. Tavi looked up. "It wilted yesterday. From heat, not thirst. You water fear you drown roots." The old woman lowered herself slowly beside the row and pushed her finger into the ground near the clay neck. "Feel there. Cool enough. Let this one wait a day. Give the center corn more. Roots are deeper there." Tavi nodded, though she hated reducing water anywhere. It felt too much like choosing what lived. Noconi saw the thought on her face. "You are not killing the edge rows. You are keeping the heart strong. A field is like a body. When the heat comes hard, blood goes where it must." Tavi looked over the 4 acres at the rows she had dug with bleeding hands while people made sport of her from the fence. The heart of it stood greenest in the middle. The edges suffered. That was true of more than fields. By the 3rd week of July, the first family came to ask. Martha Bell arrived near sundown with Lena walking half a step behind her. Martha wore gloves despite the heat, and her face had the stiff look of a woman who had practiced 3 different openings and lost them all by the time she reached the gate. Tavi was filling the western row and did not hurry. She poured the bucket dry, set it down, and walked over. Martha looked at the field before she looked at Tavi. "I was wondering," she said, "if you might explain what you're doing with the pots." Lena leaned forward. "Do the roots really drink through the clay?" Martha flushed. Lena. It is all right, Tavi said. She looked at the girl. They do not drink through it like a straw. The water seeps out slow. The roots find the dampness and gather around the pot. That way the topsoil can crack and the plant still has water underneath. Lena's eyes narrowed in concentration. So the water is hiding? No, Tavi said. It is waiting. Martha swallowed. Beyond her, her own field lay in dull rows, the corn blades folding in on themselves. Is it too late to do it now? Tavi did not answer quickly. A kind lie would have been easier and less useful. For most of this season, yes. You might save some root crops, maybe a few corn rows if you water close and cut away what is already gone. But the pots have to be in before the dry takes hold. The roots need time to come to them. Martha looked down. Lena kept looking at Tavi. Could we make them for next year? Yes, Tavi said. There is clay north of the ridge. Nakoni knows the good band. I can show you how to test it. Martha's mouth moved, but no apology came out. Tavi had not expected one. Shame was hard enough to carry without forcing it to perform. Thank you, Martha said at last. That was enough for the moment. Caleb Russ came 2 days later, and he came angry because Fear had no other coat that fit him. He stopped at the gate without taking off his hat. I got 6 children, he said before greeting her. Beans are gone. Corn's near gone. You been sitting on this trick all summer? Tavi stood with a bucket in one hand, the cloth around her palm, dark with water and old blood. I was burying pots in June. You never told anybody it would work. You stood at my fence and laughed when I told you what I was doing. His jaw tightened. A fly moved along his cheek and he slapped it too hard. That does not help me now. No, Tavi said. It does not. For a moment there was nothing between them but heat. Then his shoulders dropped a little. Not much, just enough for the truth to show through. What can I save? She could have turned him away. The thought came and left. His children had not laughed at her. She told him to abandon the beans, told him to cut the worst corn and use the water on the rows that still had green at the base, told him to shade the soil where he could and stop flooding the surface at midday because half of it was vanishing before the roots touched it. He listened badly at first, then better. When he left, Elias was standing near the barn, having arrived sometime during the conversation with a coil of rope over one shoulder. A green field can shame a whole valley without speaking one word, he said. Tavi picked up the bucket again. Then I wish shame grew corn. Folks would have full barns by winter. By the end of the month, they came in 1s and 2s. Martha returned with Lena and a notebook made from folded scraps. Caleb came back without anger and with questions he did not enjoy asking. 2 brothers from beyond Crow Creek Ridge brought a lump of clay and asked if it would hold shape. Nakoni sat beneath a cottonwood and showed them how gray clay stretched between the fingers, while iron-heavy brown clay cracked at the edges. Tavi demonstrated the pots, the spacing, the planting. She showed them how corn gave beans something to climb, how beans fed the soil, how squash shaded the ground and kept moisture from lifting away too fast. She spoke plainly. She told them what had failed. The 30 cracked pots, the row too close to the slope, the places where she had watered from fear instead of sense. People trusted failure when it was named honestly. Abel Mercer came last. He arrived alone at dusk and knocked on the gatepost instead of leaning on the fence. Tavi noticed that. She was checking the fill levels near the center rows and made him wait until she had finished. I would like to see it, he said. She opened the gate. They walked the field in silence at first. Abel crouched with difficulty and pressed his fingers 2 inches down into the soil. His hand stopped there. When he lifted it, damp earth clung beneath his nails. He looked at it for a long time. How deep are the pots? 10 inches. How far apart? 4 feet except where the slope changes. He nodded slowly, not to her but to the field. Then he began asking real questions. Soil weight, drainage, root competition, how the squash behaved near shade, whether the clay north of the ridge was the same all through or only in pockets. Tavi answered what she knew and admitted what she did not. The sun was low when he finally straightened. You have been measuring more than the creek. Yes, your well too. She looked toward the well house. He followed her gaze. His face changed. That night after Abel left, she found a county letter nailed in a folded packet to her cabin door. Elias must have brought it from town and missed her in the field. The seal was official. Her stomach tightened before she broke it. A surveyor would come in September to verify improvements on her claim. Tavi read the words twice by lamplight. Outside the field stood green against the dark, fed by water no one could see. Beside her elbow lay the notebook where she had marked the well's falling depth, the creek's dead pools, the pot count, the fill schedule, and every mistake she had made since June. She set her cracked hand flat on the paper. The valley had begun to believe because hunger had opened its ears. But county men did not always hear what the land was saying. Sometimes they only saw what their forms had room to hold. The lamp flame bent in a draft from the wall. Tavi sat still, listening to the dry night gather around the cabin, and wondered whether a buried thing could be made visible before someone with a pen decided it did not count. By the first week of September, Tavi Washaki's field looked like a lie told in green. All around it, Wind River country had gone brown and brittle. The Bell place lay flat and tired beneath the sun, its corn stripped down to stalks that rattled in the wind. Caleb Rusk's fields had the color of old rope. Even Abel Mercer's land, 30 years worked and known and trusted, had surrendered its west rows to dust. But Tavi's 4 acres stood shoulder high, in places corn lifting above the squash leaves, beans climbing in patient green spirals, potnecks showing here and there at soil level like small gray mouths breathing quietly from the earth. She stood at her fence that morning and looked at it longer than she meant to. For months, she had been too close to the work to see the whole of it. She had seen the next bucket, the next split in her palm, the next curled leaf, the next mark on the well rope. She had seen what needed doing and what might fail if she stopped. But now, in the slanted September light, she saw what others saw from the road, a living field in a dying valley. The sight did not make her proud exactly. Pride seemed too clean a word for something that had cost so much. It made her quiet. It made her aware of the ache deep under her shoulder blades, and the tenderness where her palms had healed into ridged skin. It made her think of the $47 in the tin box now gone into clay and labor and risk. It made her think of the well still lower than it ought to be. The county wagon came just after 9. Tavi heard the wheels before she saw them, iron rims grinding over the dry road. She turned from the field and saw 2 men approaching, one gray-mustached and straight-backed, the other young enough to still look uncomfortable in a stiff collar. The older man held the reins. The younger had a leather ledger already open on his knees. She wiped her hands on her skirt, then stopped. There was no point pretending she had not been working. Her boots were dusty. Her sleeves rolled, her right hand still wrapped with one strip of cloth where the skin near the thumb had split again that morning. The wagon stopped at the gate. "Miss Washaki," the older man said. "Tavi Washaki. Silas Webb, county surveyor." He gestured to the young man beside him. "Peter Hadley, clerk. We are here regarding the improvement certification on this claim." "I know." She opened the gate. "Come in." Webb stepped down without hurry. Hadley climbed after him, balancing the ledger and nearly tripping over a rut. Webb noticed the field before he noticed the cabin. His eyes moved over the corn, the squash, the fence line, the well house, then back to the soil. He was not laughing. That helped? He walked the field slowly, and Tavi walked beside him. Hadley followed, scratching notes as he went. Webb paused at the eastern row and crouched, lowering himself with the care of a man whose knees had known weather. He brushed dust from around one pot neck. "What is this unglazed clay vessel?" Tavi said. "Buried 10 inches deep, it holds water and releases it slow through the clay." Webb pressed 2 fingers into the soil a little way from the pot. He pushed down, then stopped. Damp earth darkened his fingertips. He looked up. "How far out does the moisture spread?" "Depends on the soil. Usually 2 feet, sometimes more where the roots have gathered thick." "How often do you fill them?" "Every morning when the heat was worst. Now every other morning in the outer rows and daily in the center." "How many?" 300 at the start. 291 still sound. 9 cracked or failed." Hadley looked up from the ledger then, as if the number had surprised him. Webb stood. "You have records?" "Yes." They went to the cabin. Tavi's table was rough pine, planed unevenly, with one leg shimmed by a folded scrap of leather. She laid out her papers, the notched creek record copied into pencil marks, the well-depth notes, the pot count, the dates. She had changed her filling schedule, the diagram of the rows, the failed clay mixtures. Noconi had helped her correct. Hadley wrote faster. Webb read in silence. "You measured the creek daily?" he asked. "Nearly daily. And the well?" "Every 3rd day at first, daily after the creek stopped running." Webb tapped the paper once with his finger. "Most people do not keep this kind of record. Most people had more reason to believe their fields would live." He looked at her then. Not kindly exactly, fairly. A soft knock came at the open door. Nakoni Red Willow stood there with a bundle of dried seed heads under one arm, her gray hair braided tight, her face unreadable. "I was passing," she said, though Tavi knew she had not been. Webb turned. "Ma'am," Nakoni Red Willow, Tavi said. "She helped me with clay and planting." Webb nodded. "Then I may have questions for you as well." Nakoni stepped inside. Questions are easier than drought. For the first time that morning, Hadley smiled. Webb asked where the method came from. Tavi told him about the old Mexican gardener in Colorado and Nakoni's knowledge of clay seed and dry ground. Nakoni added in her level voice that knowledge did not become superstition simply because it had traveled through hands instead of books. Webb did not argue. He wrote that down himself. When the inspection ended, he stood near the gate and looked once more across the field. "The cabin is improved," he said. "The land is under active cultivation. The crop is standing in conditions where most surrounding fields are failing. I will mark the claim substantially improved." Tavi felt her breath move out slowly. But Webb said, turning toward the well house, "Your water source is strained." "It is. The county has emergency water provisions for drought-affected claims. There is an old spring near Crow Creek Ridge. If access can be legally attached, you should apply. I do not know if they will grant it. They will not grant what is not asked." 2 days later, Elias Crowhart drove her to the county office in Lander. Hadley was behind the desk, looking even younger without Webb beside him. He shuffled forms for nearly half an hour, then frowned at the blank line marked irrigation category. "Is it well irrigation?" he asked. "Partly. Ditch number experimental agricultural improvement." Tavi thought of the old gardener Nakoni's clay, the gray band north of the ridge, the roots gathered around buried vessels older than any county form. "Call it subsurface passive irrigation," she said. Hadley blinked. "Did you invent that?" "No, I only named it for your paper." Elias, standing by the door, lowered his head to hide a smile. The harvest began under a cooler sky in early October. Martha Bell came first with Lena, who carried gloves too large for her hands, and a seriousness that made Tavi's throat tighten. Abel Mercer arrived with sharpened tools and no speech. Caleb Rusk came late, hitched his horse to the fence, and started cutting stalks before anyone could ask whether he meant to help. Nakoni sat beneath a cottonwood sorting seed corn by feel and color. Elias hauled the first loaded wagon toward the barn. It was not a perfect harvest. The south rows were thinner where Tavi had buried the pots too shallow. The northwest corner had beans strangled by squash shade. Some ears were small, some pods dry, some lessons expensive. But the central rows came in heavy. Real corn, real beans, squash fat enough to thump with the heel of the hand. By the fourth day, the root cellar held more food than Tavi had dared imagine in July. She paid every helper in shares. Martha tried to refuse. Tavi would not let her. "Work for work," Tavi said. Martha nodded and took the sack. After the harvest, Elias brought the news. He came at dusk when the field lay cut and strange, all its green weight removed the pot necks showing more clearly now in the bare ground. Tavi was coiling rope beside the barn when he stepped through the gate with his hat in his hands. "There is a land firm out of Cheyenne," he said. "Harton and Vale." She waited. "They have been buying failed claims. Cheap. Drought knocks a family down county, marks the land poor or under-improved family cannot hold through winter, and Harton buys at auction. How many six that I know?" The rope went still in her hands. Elias looked toward her field. "Your crop makes trouble for that story. If your claim is viable, others might have been too. If the land can be worked with better water practice, then failure is not just the land's fault." A week later, the letter came. Harton and Vale wrote with polished courtesy and cold teeth. They offered $80 for her claim, calling it generous under uncertain agricultural conditions. They mentioned, without quite stating, that unconventional irrigation might complicate her improvement status. They referred to questions around the county assessment. Tavi read it once. Then again. The cabin seemed smaller afterward. Nakoni came that evening and listened while Tavi read the letter aloud. Elias stood by the stove, arms crossed. "They cannot steal what is tied down," Nakoni said. "Memory alone is not tied down." Elias looked at the papers spread across the table. "If they cannot see the work, then we will write it down until they have no choice." So Tavi wrote. She wrote the gray clay band north of the ridge, the way it stretched before cracking. She wrote the sand mixture, the pot size, the drying time, the burial depth, the 4-foot spacing. She wrote the morning filling schedule and the signs of leaf stress. She wrote what had failed 30 early pots, Ruin 9, cracked in the ground, shallow rose, weakened squash shade too heavy in the northwest corner. Noconi added notes about seed timing and clay storage. Elias carried the pages to Webb. The reply came 6 days later. Assessment stands. Documentation accepted. Harton and Vale inquiry under review. Tavi read the words by lamplight until they stopped shaking in her hand. Then she folded the letter and placed it in the tin box beneath the loose floorboard beside her old calculations and the last coins she had not spent. Outside, frost silvered the harvested field. The pots lay hidden again under dark soil, quiet as buried witnesses. But somewhere in a county office, the work beneath the ground had found its way onto paper, and paper Tavi was beginning to understand could carry water of its own. Winter came down over Wind River country like a door closing. The first snow did not fall gently. It came sideways out of the northwest, hard and fine as ground glass driving through the cottonwoods, hissing along the cabin walls, filling the wagon ruts and the spaces beneath the fence rails, until Tavi could no longer see where the road ended and her field began. By the second morning, the world beyond her window was white and shapeless. The cut corn rows were gone. The gray pot necks were gone. Even the well path had disappeared, and she had to find it by memory one careful step at a time, with a rope tied from the porch post to the well frame so she would not lose herself 20 yards from her own door. The drought had ended, but Mercy had not followed it. Cold had its own teeth. The water barrel froze solid along the rim. The barn door swelled and stuck. Her mule stood steaming in the stall, offended by every living fact of winter. At night, the wind pressed against the cabin as if testing each place she had patched with mudgrass and stubbornness. The 2 wall logs she had replaced the year before held. The chinking held. The roof complained, but didn't give. Tavi lay awake those first nights listening to the cabin survive. She had food in the root cellar, corn stacked, dry beans and sacks, squash curing along the barn wall under straw. Not plenty in the way rich people use the word. Enough. Enough to measure. Enough to plan, enough that each morning she could rise, build the fire, put coffee on, and not feel the old panic closing around her throat. That was what the clay pots had bought her. Not comfort, a margin. She spent the long white days making more pots. The clay sat under blankets in the barn, packed in straw, the way Noconi had told her, though the outer sacks still froze once, and cracked at the edges before Tavi learned to keep them nearer the interior wall. She wrote that down. Failure and fix, both belonged in the record. At night, she worked by lamplight, rolling clay between her palms, shaping it into round-bellied vessels with narrow throats. Her hands had healed from summer, but not back to what they had been. The skin was thicker now, ridged near the thumb tender in cold weather. Her back ached when snow came. Her knees disliked the floor. Her body, large and tired and faithful in the way useful things are faithful, carried her through the work one evening after another. Noconi came during a break in the weather and sat by the stove without asking permission. She brought dried sage and 2 bundles of seed corn wrapped in cloth. "You store clay better now," she said. "I stored it wrong first. That is how people learn things they remember." They shaped pots together for an hour without speaking. Noconi's hands moved slower than Tavi's, but wasted less. When she left, there were 6 new vessels on the shelf and no speech about gratitude between them. That suited them both. Martha Bell sent bread the next week. Lena sent a crooked little clay pot no taller than Tavi's thumb with a note written in careful letters. It cracked, but only on one side. "I know why." Tavi read the note twice and smiled before she could stop herself. Abel Mercer sent word through Elias that the deeper gray deposit west of the ridge had less grit than the band Tavi had used. Caleb Rusk sent a sack of clean sand and no note at all. Elias brought lamp oil paper and news from town, setting each item on her table as if he were unloading freight and not kindness. She accepted what came because pride had been useful once, but not always. In January, Harton and Vale wrote again. Their letter was smooth and careful, and meaner than the first because it had less confidence in it. They repeated their offer. They mentioned uncertainty. They suggested that unconventional systems might not support long-term homestead viability. They wrote around the threat the way a wolf circles a pen. Tavi read the letter with coffee going cold beside her hand. Then she pulled the tin box from beneath the loose floorboard. Silas Webb's assessment, the emergency spring access approval, her harvest figures, the witness names from extraction day, the pages of documentation she had written with Noconi's notes tucked into the margins. Harton and Vale had paper. So did she. Her reply took less time than Fear expected. She declined the offer. She stated that the assessment stood. She stated that the land was improved. The water access recorded the crop harvested and the method documented in county files. She wrote that she had no intention of selling a claim she had made viable with her own labor. She signed her name slowly. Tavita Washaki, not Tavi, not girl, not the name other people shortened because it made her easier to handle. Elias carried the letter through snow when the road opened. In March, the answer came from Webb, not from Harton and Vale. It was 4 pages long, official at the top and personal only at the bottom. Webb had filed a complaint with the Territorial Land Commission, citing Harton and Vale's pattern of buying drought-failed claims after pressuring assessments. 6 claims, 6 families. Tavi's documentation had been included as evidence that the land itself was not hopeless and that water practice timing and access could change the outcome. At the bottom in Webb's tight hand he had written, "Your record made the pattern visible." Tavi sat with that sentence a long while. She had thought she was writing to protect her own field, her own well, her own right to stay. She had not thought of 6 families loading wagons with what could be carried and leaving behind what could not. She had not thought of her clay pots sitting in a territorial office like witnesses called from underground. Nokoni read the letter when she came that evening. "Some seeds sleep longer than one winter," she said. By May, the Land Commission had answered. 2 claims were returned to families who had been improperly assessed. 2 remained under review. 2 were gone into legal tangles Tavi did not understand and could not untie. Harton and Vale were fined and censured, though not broken. Men with money were rarely broken by the first true thing said against them. Tavi wanted the letter to feel better than it did. 2 families had land again. 4 did not. Justice had come into the room, but it had not filled it. She took the letter outside and stood in the thawing yard while mud held at her boots. The creek had begun moving again, thin but alive. Above the cottonwoods, the sky had softened into a blue that did not look cruel. "You did not fix everything," Elias said from the gate. He had ridden up, quiet. "I know. That does not mean nothing was fixed." She folded the letter. "I know that too. Spring came late, but it came." Tavi buried 331 pots across the expanded field, the old ones and the new ones together. The work was still hard. The shovel still jarred her wrists. Her breath still came heavy when she bent too long. But the fear was different now. Her body knew the rhythm. Her hands knew how deep. Her eyes knew where the slope would carry moisture and where the squash would shade too much if she let it. And she was not the only one digging. Across the valley, Abel Mercer put pots into his east field with a precision that made younger men look careless. Martha Bell and Lena buried theirs near the creek slope, Lena checking depth with a stick of her own. Caleb Rusk made his in the barn and pretended the idea had arrived to him through weather, and thought, though, his children told everyone otherwise. Nokoni took 3 families to the gray clay band north of the ridge. Elias carried diagrams farther out along the freight road folded into flower orders and seed packets. The method moved like water underground. A young clerk named Daniel Marsh came in June from the Territorial Agricultural Office with clean cuffs, a leather case, and the uneasy posture of a man who knew paper better than fields. He asked to document her system. Tavi almost refused. "I do not need to become a story," she said. Elias, standing by the fence, looked over the green rows. "You already are one. Better tell it straight before someone else makes it soft." So she answered Daniel's questions. He asked what she had risked when she bought the first pots. Tavi looked toward the field where corn stood young and bright in the rain-washed air. "The crop," she said. "The claim. The winter." She paused. "And the part of me that believed I could belong to this land." Daniel wrote that down more slowly than the rest. Rain came that month, real rain running off the cabin roof and darkening the road. The valley breathed easier. Men who had spoken of ruin began speaking of yield. Women opened windows. Children ran barefoot where dust had been. Tavi kept filling the pots, not every day, not like the drought year, but enough. Abel Mercer stopped his wagon by her fence one morning and watched her pour water into a clay neck while the field around her still smelled of last night's rain. "You're still filling them," he said. "Yes." He looked at the sky, then at the soil, then at her. Smart. For Abel, it was nearly a sermon. The harvest that year came strong. Tavi's field held. Abel's east acreage did better than it ever had. Martha's slope stayed green through a dry spell in July. Lena's little patch grew corn taller than her shoulder, and she walked through it with the solemn pride of someone who had helped keep a promise. By the time snow returned, the valley had learned to look differently at bare ground. Tavi stood at her window with coffee warming her hands while white settled over the field. From the road there was nothing to see, no corn, no squash, no potnecks, no proof of dark mornings, cracked hands, county letters, clay tests, ruined vessels, or water poured before sunrise. Just snow. But beneath it lay the pots. In the barn waited more clay. In the tin box were records. In county files were her diagrams. In Lena Bell's hands was a small notebook with mud on the cover. In 2 recovered homes, families were cutting wood for winter on land they had nearly lost. Tavi watched the snow gather along the fence rails and thought people see the green field. They do not see the dark mornings that made it. She did not say it aloud. Some truths did not need to leave the room to become real. She finished her coffee and set the cup down. There was clay to check in the barn before the temperature dropped. The well rope needed mending. When the creek thawed, she would press the notched stick into the mud at the same bend as always. Lena would come in spring to help with the 3 sisters planting. Daniel would send his paper. Nokoni would correct what needed correcting. Elias would pretend freight brought him by when kindness did. And before the dry season thought to come, Tavi Washaki would bury water in the earth again. Outside the valley lay quiet under snow. Beneath the frozen ground, the hidden work waited patient and alive.